Hello, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to today's video. Today I have a mic. I hope it makes a difference. It might not. I haven't quite figured out how to use it, but if it doesn't, it definitely will make a difference by the time the next video comes around. So stay tuned. So today I'm going to talk about what it takes to be a good person, what it means to be good in this day and age, in today's world. And I want to touch upon this sort of idea that I've been thinking about of like moral laziness, and how I think a lot of us have become morally quite lazy. We define ourselves as good people without necessarily ever actually doing good, and sometimes even doing bad. Let's get into it. I think that good is very difficult to define. Philosophers have tried to define it for millennia, and for a very long time, good, and even more so now actually, good has been something that's been collectively constructed. Different groups sort of form a consensus on what is deemed as good. It's something that's communally agreed upon, whether that be by like a large group or a small group. Everyone's personal sort of perceptions of good and bad can be influenced by obviously more than one group. It can be like family, like the general society that you live in, religion, that kind of thing. I think that these standards for good or of good that are defined collectively or constructed collectively aren't static. They move and they change depending on time and place and context. This is at the core, I think, how we mostly form our moral compasses. That is a big part of it. I don't think there's anything wrong with this per se. It's great that we uphold certain standards of morality for each other, but I think it can become a bit of a grey area if we consider sort of the kind of society system we live in today. So I think, yeah, forming it with these groups is a good thing, but it needs to come sort of with a caveat of like being able to evaluate under each circumstance whether the good that's being prescribed by a group that you identify with is actually good. And in my opinion, we've lost a lot of that second thing, and goodness has become more about conformity and ego, in the sense of like feeling good because you belong to a group and have ascribed your ideas and thoughts and feelings about goodness to the ones of the group, and are being perceived by the group as good rather than actually just doing good for the sake of good. And I think in this case it becomes very easy to let our standards for morality slip, and leads us to what I'm calling moral laziness. This entails essentially going along with what appeases the group first, makes us feel good and in line and our ego satisfied, rather than doing what is actually right given a particular context, especially when that is the difficult thing. So this hasn't always been the case. We haven't always been so concerned with being perceived as good. And the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau talked about this, and he differentiated between two different sort of drivers of action, which, I mean, I guess in this context we'll use drivers of like good. So the first was called amour de soi. I'm not good with French, sorry, which essentially just means love of the self. And this existed when we were much simpler beings, when we just sort of existed to essentially eat, sleep, reproduce. This was like sort of the state of nature. All of our actions were driven by essentially the need to self-sustain. It wasn't particularly harmful or like violent necessarily, because we lived in very like small isolated communities, and our actions didn't impact others that much. It was relative peace, essentially. The secondary kind of driver of action has emerged as society has grown bigger, we gained more contact with different communities, with different people. Basically, the world became globalized. And this he called amour propre, again with the French, sorry. And this is where we have a lot more interaction with people in large groups. As a driver of action that comes from self-concern, it leads us to be for others. We act out of how we're going to be perceived by others, perceived by a group, rather than acting, you know, for the sake of ourselves or self-sustenance or whatever. It is an inherently competitive and sort of ego-driven action driver, I suppose. This is what I'm gonna operate with and argue that this is the standard of good, that for good, that many of us are operating under. A good that looks to be perceived as good, to satisfy our own ego through being accepted by and seen as good by others, rather than being good for the sake of good. So I think this is also just further solidified by social media and like the internet today, but then also how polarized different political camps are these days. I mean, for example, look at the like Instagram infographic complex of 2020. This was sort of a cornerstone historical moment in what it is to engage in almost like morality or like virtue signaling in this day and age. And I mean, it's kind of continued. Whenever there is an issue that comes up that has been decided by the world that it is an important issue that people need to be talking about, the first thing that people want to do isn't to necessarily go and look into that issue and see where they stand and evaluate how they feel about that issue. It is to post on their Instagram story that they know what's happening. They don't actually think about whether this is what they actually believe. It's just about showing others that they know, they are aware, they're a good person. It isn't about going away doing the kind of work that allows them to sit with themselves and think about where they stand in an issue. It's about just showing that they are part of the wave of people who suddenly seem to care about this thing. It's sort of an insubstantial tick box exercise that requires no further reflection or further examination of whichever issue is at hand. It is just about conformity, self-satisfaction through that conformity. It's the same when we look at how divided politically society is becoming. Morality isn't about necessarily examining what is actually good for humanity under whichever conditions. It is about being right and your camp coming out on top. We've become, like I keep saying, morally lazy. And I think both of these examples go to show how this is the case, because instead of engaging with the practice of choosing what is good for ourselves, like critically engaging with what is prescribed as good and deciding whether that actually is good for us or is good for humanity, we are swept in what might look good to the masses. It is actually quite terrifying if we examine our current reality against those realities depicted in fiction, in dystopian fiction. So I recently read Brave New World by Huxley, and I've been thinking about the comparisons between that and Orwell's 1984, which are two, kind of like pillar dystopian texts. And both novels hyperbolize the complexities of goodness and morality and what is good and what is true, and like how both are very subjective and they can be used in very destructive ways when their meanings are not critically examined. I think this is even more interesting in the case of Brave New World, because this depicts a reality in which people are controlled and managed through pleasure rather than fear, as often is kind of assumed to be the case with a lot of dystopia, and this is what happens in 1984. I think the Brave New World showcases this sort of realm in which shallow happiness and conformity sort of must be maintained at all costs, and always in sacrifice of individual autonomy and humanity in general. It almost mirrors the sort of distraction, dopamine-driven society that we live in right now, where above all we seek sort of instant gratification and pleasure and satisfaction of the ego before we do anything else. It often comes at the cost of our ability to fully process and evaluate information. These worlds, these dystopian worlds, are the kinds of worlds in which people challenge the status quo as little as possible. They go with the flow regardless of whether it's harming them or their fellow humans, as long as their own self-perception, ego, how they are seen as by whichever group they belong to, are all sort of satisfied. It's a kind of world in which we lazily allow good to be defined for us without questioning it. It relies upon majority passivity. It's a kind of passivity that is quite sinister. I think it's a very, very slippery slope. And this leans quite well into something I've spoken about before, which is the banality of evil. It's Hannah Arendt's conception of sort of evil. She wrote extensively on it, essentially saying that, it's the most common kind of evil that we find out there. And it's caused by a population who is unconcerned with the active choice of good. They are fine to be passive. It is the consequence of a morally lazy population. And this comes from the idea that people think that because they're not actively doing bad, they're just going with the flow. They aren't actually doing any bad. But this isn't the case. The inability to examine whether what they're being sold as good is actually good very much makes them an agent of harm, although passive. It becomes very easy for self-defining good people to become complicit in evil, because the conditions of it may be produced by, for example, a state, and it is often the easier option to just go along with what is being defined as good rather than choosing actual good by resisting it. And it's much easier to go along with it when we aren't critically engaging with what is being sold to us or thinking about whether it is actual good. We're just going with it. Passivity, this kind of passivity, becomes complicity in evil or in bad. So, if this is how the world is now, many of us are falling into this trap of moral laziness as defined by, passivity and inability to, or refusal to critically analyze what truth and good might mean for us individually. Then what does it actually take to be a good person in this day and age? To live a life that promotes goodness? I might argue that because of these very reasons that I've spoken about, passivity inaction, distraction, and the surface level sort of like often ego-driven way many of us go about doing good, i.e. to only be perceived as good rather than to do it for the sake of it. What it takes to be good comes from the opposite of passivity. It comes from activity. It comes from action. And this is a very like Aristotelian way of looking at morality, specifically virtue ethics. It's a conception of good that is grounded in virtuous character that comes only through action. Like according to Aristotle, who was an ancient Greek philosopher, one of the greats, the aim of human life is to do good, to be good. We achieve this through virtue, and virtue is consistently choosing courses of action which promote good. So yes, he has this idea that there are virtues and there are vices, and then there's like sort of the golden mean. It's a whole thing. But anyway, the whole idea is like that virtue is a behavior. It is a series of self-imposed movements which guide whether we go through the world through goodness, essentially. It's a self-defined good. One that, I mean, obviously, because like I said earlier, our moral compasses are shaped by, you know, society, our families, etc. Our abstract concept of good comes from these things, but the way that we choose to act in specific contexts should come through this idea of like virtuous character and always choosing good for you given a context. It's harder to be swayed by external factors because this kind of character means that you can see a tide of people going one way and what they believe is good, and instead of just joining the tide without thinking about it, you hold on for a little bit, you watch the direction that the tide is going in, and you decide whether that is a direction that you want to go in, that you believe is the actual good thing to do. And if it's not, then you hold on and you stay. That's what it takes to act virtuously, to not be passive. A good person is someone who has virtue as a disposition. It is something they've cultivated through action, through always choosing to do the virtuous thing. This can be even extended to circumstances in which there's an option to do bad and it's the easier thing to do, or there's an option to do nothing, which, you know, in some cases they're still doing bad, and they still choose good. I think that in a world that's trying to numb us and distract us and sort of make us the kind of passive that makes us complicit in not doing good, to be good is to choose to act every day. It's choosing to act in accordance to, yes, the principles that, you know, ground us, we have learned from those around us, but also to engage in those with a critical eye, with one that allows us to evaluate their credibility and alignment with us based on a broader context. A key part of this comes from learning how to examine our own assumptions and biases and where they might come from and where they might take us to, and exercising this muscle that I keep talking about, critical analysis, in order to be able to differentiate between what is real and what is not, aligned with one's principles and not. I think we really need to work beyond the perception of our own goodness as defined by external factors. Think about what it means to ground good for the most part within ourselves, by the actions that we choose to take, even when they go against the good that has been prescribed to us. This is what it takes to be truly good in this day and age. It's to be grounded in your principles and, yes, open to hearing, listening to everything going on around you, and having the ability to filter through the noise, not be immediately swayable by the tides of opinion or passive to the dominant behavior. If by Aristotle's definition, virtuous action becomes characterized by doing, then we must do. Passivity is a gateway to complicity in horrible things, and it's a state that we have to overcome. Moral laziness is something that we have to get beyond. So yes, that is my take for today. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I would love to know your thoughts. Obviously, this video could have been so much longer. There are so many things I could have gone into more detail about, but it's just some thoughts that I've been having and wanted to sort of get down and out there. I'd love to chat some more about this in the comments, so let me know your thoughts. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.